When you hear the name Cleopatra, what's the first thing that comes to mind? A stunning Egyptian queen, draped in gold, famous for her beauty and her love affairs with powerful Roman men like Julius Caesar and Mark Antony. That's the story we've all been told, the one Hollywood loves to sell. But what if I told you that is only a tiny glamorized fraction of her real story? The truth is, Cleopatra was one of the most brilliant and formidable political minds of her time. Forget the myths. Let's uncover the real woman who held the fate of an empire in her hands. Cleopatra, the seventh Philopator, wasn't even Egyptian by blood. She was Greek, the last ruler of the Ptolemaic dynasty that had governed Egypt for nearly 300 years after Alexander the Great's conquest. When she ascended the throne, Egypt was in a precarious position. The Roman Republic was expanding aggressively, swallowing up kingdoms left and right. For a young ruler, survival wasn't just about managing her own kingdom. It was about outsmarting the most powerful empire the world had ever seen. And this is where her true genius shines. Her education was extraordinary. While many rulers were content with military training, Cleopatra was a scholar. She was reportedly the first Ptolemaic ruler to actually learn the Egyptian language, a huge sign of respect to her people. But she didn't stop there. She spoke as many as 9 languages, including Greek, Parthian, and Latin. This wasn't just a party trick. It was a powerful diplomatic tool. Imagine negotiating directly with foreign ambassadors in their own tongue, without needing a translator. It allowed her to build personal connections, understand nuances, and control the narrative in a way her rivals simply couldn't. She was also a master of economics and administration. She knew that to keep Egypt independent, she had to make it indispensable to Rome. Egypt was the breadbasket of the Mediterranean, and she expertly managed its vast agricultural wealth. She controlled the grain supply, a resource Rome desperately needed to feed its growing population and armies. This economic leverage was one of her greatest weapons. She wasn't just a queen, she was the CEO of Egypt, and business was booming. Now, let's talk about her famous relationships. It's easy to dismiss her connections with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony as simple romances, but that completely misunderstands her strategy. These were not just love affairs. They were political alliances of the highest order. When she met Caesar, she was in the middle of a civil war with her own brother. She needed a powerful ally to secure her throne. By aligning with Caesar, the most powerful man in Rome, she not only won her kingdom back, but also secured Roman protection for Egypt. She bore him a son, Caesarion, linking her dynasty directly to Rome's future. It was a calculated, audacious move. After Caesar's assassination, Rome was thrown into chaos. Cleopatra didn't panic. She assessed the new power players and strategically allied herself with Mark Antony. This wasn't just about passion, it was about survival. Antony controlled the eastern half of the Roman Empire, and together, they formed a powerful bloc that could challenge his rival, Octavian. For a time, their alliance created a new center of power in the east, with Alexandria as its glittering capital. She presented herself and Antony as new deities, Isis and Osiris, a brilliant piece of propaganda that resonated with both Egyptians and Greeks. Cleopatra's goal was never to be a Roman consort. Her ambition was far greater. She envisioned a new Hellenistic empire, ruled from Alexandria, with her children as its heirs. She used her intelligence, her charisma, and her resources to play the game of power in a world dominated by men. She wasn't a pawn. She was a player, moving her own pieces on the geopolitical chessboard. Ultimately, she and Antony were defeated by Octavian at the Battle of Actium. But even in defeat, she controlled her own destiny. Rather than being paraded through the streets of Rome as a captive in Octavian's triumph, the ultimate humiliation, she chose to end her own life. This final act was not one of weakness, but of ultimate defiance. She refused to let her enemy write the final chapter of her story. So, the next time you think of Cleopatra, remember the real woman behind the legend. Not just a beauty, but a brilliant linguist, a sharp economist, a cunning diplomat, and a ruler who fought fiercely to protect her people and her kingdom against impossible odds. She was a true force of nature, a mind that challenged an empire. Imagine a world where one nation held the key to an empire's survival. It was Egypt in the time of Cleopatra. For centuries, her family, the Ptolemies, had ruled over a land of incredible wealth. The Nile's annual flood guaranteed bountiful harvests, making Egypt the breadbasket of the Mediterranean. Its granaries were overflowing, not just with wheat, but with gold, papyrus, and exotic goods that flowed down the river and into bustling ports like Alexandria. This city wasn't just a hub of trade. It was the intellectual and cultural heart of the world, home to the great library and the towering Pharos lighthouse. Egypt wasn't just rich, it was legendary. But while Egypt glittered on the outside, its foundations were cracking. The Ptolemaic dynasty was plagued by internal strife. Sibling rivalries, assassinations, and civil wars had become a grim tradition. The rulers were often seen as outsiders, a Greek dynasty governing an ancient Egyptian population. This constant instability weakened the kingdom from within, making it a tempting target for any power with ambition. And across the Mediterranean, a new power was rising, one with an insatiable appetite for conquest and resources. That power was Rome. Rome was a military juggernaut, a republic rapidly expanding into an empire. But this expansion came at a cost. Feeding its massive armies and a growing urban population in the city of Rome itself was a constant challenge. Roman politics were a viper's nest of ambition, where generals and senators vied for power, prestige, and, most importantly, wealth to fund their legions and political campaigns. They looked eastward, and their gaze fell upon the shimmering prize of Egypt. To a Roman general, controlling Egypt meant controlling the grain supply. Control the grain, and you control Rome itself. This is the world Cleopatra was born into. She wasn't just a queen. She was a brilliant strategist who understood the precarious position of her kingdom. She knew that Egypt's immense wealth was both its greatest asset and its most dangerous liability. It was a magnet for Roman greed. While her predecessors had often stumbled, Cleopatra saw the situation with stark clarity. She knew she couldn't fight Rome's legions head-on. Egypt's military, once formidable, was no match for the disciplined and battle-hardened Roman forces. A direct confrontation would be suicide. So, she chose a different battlefield. The minds and hearts of Rome's most powerful men. Cleopatra recognized that Rome wasn't a monolith. It was a collection of ambitious individuals. If she could bind the most powerful man in Rome to her cause, she could use his power as a shield to protect her kingdom. Her strategy was not one of surrender, but of alliance. It was a high-stakes gamble. She would use her intellect, her charm, and Egypt's vast resources not to fight Rome, but to co-opt it, to make Egypt an indispensable partner rather than a conquered province. Her relationships with Julius Caesar and later Mark Antony were not merely love affairs. They were masterstrokes of political maneuvering. By aligning herself with them, she secured Egypt's autonomy and placed herself at the very center of Roman politics. She wasn't just the Queen of Egypt. She was a kingmaker in Rome. For a time, her strategy worked brilliantly. She preserved her throne and the independence of her kingdom against incredible odds. But the currents of Roman politics were treacherous and ever. The assassination of Caesar and the subsequent civil war that pitted her ally, Mark Antony, against the calculating Octavian, would ultimately seal her fate. Octavian saw Cleopatra not as an ally, but as a foreign threat, a symbol of the decadent East corrupting Roman values. He used propaganda to turn public opinion against her and Antony, painting their alliance as a betrayal of Rome. The final confrontation was inevitable. The Battle of Actium wasn't just a naval battle. It was the clash of two worlds, the culmination of a century of Roman ambition and Egyptian resistance. In the end, Rome's relentless drive for absolute control proved unstoppable. Cleopatra's death marked the end of her dynasty, the end of pharaonic Egypt, and the beginning of Egypt's new chapter as a province of the Roman Empire. Its wealth now flowing directly into the coffers of history is filled with epic love stories. But have you ever heard one that almost tore the world's greatest empire apart? This isn't just a romance. It's a high-stakes game of power, ambition, and betrayal. Let's dive into the incredible true story of Cleopatra and Mark Antony. Imagine this. Rome is in chaos after the assassination of Julius Caesar. The Republic is fracturing, and powerful men are scrambling for control. One of these men is Mark Antony, Caesar's loyal right hand, a charismatic general, loved by his soldiers. He heads east to secure the wealthy provinces, and that's where he decides to summon the Queen of Egypt, Cleopatra. He expects a subordinate queen to come begging for favor. But Cleopatra was no ordinary ruler. She knew first impressions were everything. Instead of arriving like a servant, she sailed up the Kidnus River in a magnificent golden barge, dressed as Venus, the Roman goddess of love. The air was filled with the scent of perfumes, and she was surrounded by Antony, who thought he was summoning her, ended up being her guest at a series of lavish banquets. He was completely captivated. This wasn't just about her famous beauty. It was her intellect, her wit, and her sheer political brilliance. She spoke multiple languages and could hold her own in any conversation. For Antony, who was more a soldier than a statesman, she was intoxicating. What started as a political meeting quickly blossomed into a passionate alliance. Antony spent the winter of 41 BC in Alexandria with Cleopatra, and it was a season of legendary indulgence. They formed a society called the Inimitable Livers, dedicating themselves to a life of pleasure and feasting. But don't be mistaken, this was more than just a whirlwind romance. For Cleopatra, this alliance was crucial for survival. She needed Rome's military might to protect her throne and secure Egypt's independence. For Antony, Egypt's immense wealth was the key to funding his armies and his political ambitions back in Rome. It was a perfect match of power and resources, wrapped in genuine affection. They had 3 children together, further cementing their personal and political bond. Back in Rome, however, another player was making his move. Caesar's adopted son and heir, Octavian. He was young, calculating, and patient. While Antony was living it up in Egypt, Octavian was consolidating his power in Italy, portraying himself as the true Roman, the guardian of tradition. He saw Antonius' relationship with Cleopatra as a golden opportunity for propaganda. He painted Antony as a man who had abandoned his Roman duties, bewitched by a foreign queen. He spread stories that Antony planned to move the capital of the Roman Empire to Alexandria and rule with Cleopatra as his co-regent. To a Roman public, this was terrifying. The idea of being ruled by an Eastern monarch, especially a woman, was unthinkable. The tension between Antony and Octavian finally reached its breaking point. Antony, needing to reassert his Roman credentials, married Octavian's sister, Octavia. It was a purely political move to patch things up, but his heart remained in Egypt. He couldn't stay away from Cleopatra for long. He eventually returned to her, and this was the final straw. He publicly declared Caesarion, Cleopatra's son, with Julius Caesar, as Caesar's true heir, directly challenging Octavian's legitimacy. He also divided the eastern territories among Cleopatra and their children, an act known as the Donations of Alexandria. For Octavian, this was a declaration of war. He cleverly obtained Antony's will and read it aloud to the Roman Senate. The will reportedly confirmed Antony's desire to be buried in Alexandria with Cleopatra. This was the ultimate proof for the Roman people that Antony had turned his back on Rome. The Senate stripped Antony of his powers and declared war, not on Antony himself, but on Cleopatra. This was a genius political move, framing the conflict as a patriotic war against a foreign threat, not another messy Roman civil war. The final showdown came at the naval battle of Actium in 31 BC. It was a massive confrontation. Antony and Cleopatra combined their fleets against Octavian's navy, commanded by the brilliant Admiral Agrippa. The battle did not go as planned. For reasons historians still debate, Cleopatra's squadron suddenly broke from the line of battle and fled. Seeing her leave, Antony abandoned his command and his men, and sailed after her with a few ships. His fleet, leaderless and demoralized, was utterly defeated. The end was swift and tragic. Antony and Cleopatra retreated to Alexandria, their power shattered. Octavian's forces closed in. Hearing a false rumor that Cleopatra had taken her own life, Antony fell on his sword. He was brought to Cleopatra's mausoleum, where he died in her arms, left alone and facing the humiliation of being paraded through Rome in chains as a war trophy. Cleopatra made her own final choice. According to the famous story, she had a poisonous asp smuggled to her in a basket of figs, and ended her life with a dignity that her conqueror could not take away. Their love story was real, but it was also a political strategy that ultimately failed. They bet everything on each other and their combined power, but they underestimated the cunning of Octavian and the power of Roman propaganda. Their story serves as a timeless warning about the dangers of mixing personal passion with political ambition. It's a tragedy of epic proportions. A love that burned so brightly it consumed 2 of history's most powerful figures and reshaped the Have you ever wondered how one person can turn an entire empire against its most famous general and a legendary queen? Well, it all comes down to a masterclass in manipulation and public relations. Ancient Roman style. The star of our show today is a young man named Octavian. You might know him better by his later title, Augustus, the first Roman emperor. But before he was Augustus, he was a teenager with a massive inheritance. A famous last name, he was Julius Caesar's adopted son, and an ambition that could rival the gods themselves. After Caesar's assassination, Rome was a chaotic mess. Power was split between a few key players, forming the second triumvirate: Octavian, the brilliant but arrogant general Mark Antony, and another guy named Lepidus who, well, let's just say he didn't last long in this high-stakes game. For a while, Octavian and Antony were allies, but both men knew that Rome wasn't big enough for the two of them. Sooner or later, there would be a final showdown. Antony had a major advantage. He was a seasoned military commander, respected by the legions, and he controlled the wealthy eastern provinces of the empire. He also had a very powerful and charismatic ally in Cleopatra, the Queen of Egypt. Together, they were a formidable power couple. Octavian, on the other hand, was based in Rome. It was young, less experienced in battle, and needed a way to level the playing field. He couldn't beat Antony with just swords and shields. So, he decided to fight with words. This is where things get really clever. Octavian launched one of the most effective propaganda campaigns in history. He began to flood Rome with stories, rumors, and accusations aimed at destroying Antony's reputation. His central message was simple, but devastatingly effective. Antony was no longer a true Roman. He had been bewitched by a foreign queen, Cleopatra. Octavian's agents spread pamphlets and whispered in the marketplaces. They painted Antony as a drunkard, a slave to his passions, and completely under Cleopatra's thumb. They claimed he was abandoning Roman traditions and adopting decadent Eastern customs. Imagine the headlines if they had tabloids back then. Antony to move Rome's capital to Egypt, or general seen wearing foreign silks. Forgets his toga. These weren't just personal attacks. They were designed to hit at the very core of Roman identity. Romans were proud, traditional, and deeply suspicious of foreign influence, especially from the opulent and, in Tyrai's corrupt East. Cleopatra was the perfect villain for Octavian's narrative. She was portrayed not as the intelligent and capable ruler she was, but as a dangerous seductress, a foreign sorceress who was using Antony to seize control of the Roman Empire for herself. The propaganda claimed she dreamed of conquering Rome and ruling from the capital. This was a terrifying thought for the average Roman citizen. Octavian was framing the coming conflict not as a civil war between two Romans, but as a patriotic war to defend Rome from a foreign invader. The masterstroke came with Antony's will. Octavian somehow got his hands on it, or at least a document he claimed was Antony's will. He read it aloud in the Senate, and its contents were explosive. The will supposedly confirmed everything Octavian had been saying. It declared Antony's children with Cleopatra as his heirs, left large Roman territories to them, and expressed his wish to be buried in Alexandria, Egypt, alongside Cleopatra. Whether the will was real or a brilliant forgery, it didn't matter. The damage was done. For the people of Rome, this was the final proof. Antony had turned his back on them. He was no longer one of them. He was an enemy, a puppet of a foreign queen with designs on their city. Public opinion swung decisively. The Senate, fueled by this manufactured outrage, stripped Antony of his powers and officially declared war not on Antony, but on Cleopatra. It was a genius move. Octavian could now go to war, not as a power-hungry rival, but as the defender of Roman values, the champion of the Republic against a foreign threat. This incredible story shows that politics hasn't changed all that much. Controlling the narrative is just as important as controlling the army. Octavian's strategic use of propaganda completely reshaped the political landscape, isolating his rival and uniting Rome behind him. It paved the way for his final victory at the Battle of Actium and his ultimate rise as the sole ruler of the Roman world. He didn't just win. Hey everyone, and welcome back to the channel. Today, we're diving into one of history's most epic and tragic love stories, one that culminates in a legendary naval clash. The Battle of Actium. This wasn't just a battle. It was the final, dramatic showdown that would decide the fate of Rome and seal the destiny of two of its most famous figures, Mark Antony and Cleopatra. So, let's set the stage. The year is 31 BC. The Roman world is split in two. In the west, you have Octavian, Julius Caesar's ambitious and calculating heir. In the east, you have Mark Antony, Caesar's loyal general, now allied with and deeply in love with Cleopatra, the captivating queen of Egypt. For years, tension between these two power players had been simmering, fueled by political ambition, propaganda, and personal rivalry. It was a powder keg waiting for a spark, and that spark was about to ignite off the coast of western Greece. Antony and Cleopatra had gathered a massive force at Actium. Their fleet was impressive, featuring enormous quinquiremes, huge, powerful warships that were like floating fortresses. Their plan was to break through Octavian's naval blockade and either fight another day or secure a decisive victory. On the other side, Octavian's fleet, commanded by the brilliant Admiral Marcus Agrippa, was smaller and more agile. His ships, called Liburnians, were faster and easier to maneuver. It was a classic contest of brute strength versus speed and strategy. As the battle began on September 2nd, the scene must have been pure chaos. Hundreds of ships clashed, oars splintered, and the sea turned into a battlefield. Antony's larger ships were formidable, but Agrippa's nimbler vessels danced around them, using their speed to outmaneuver the giants. They could swim a single large ship, ramming it and setting it ablaze before retreating out of reach. It was like watching a pack of wolves take on a bear. Then, the turning point. For reasons historians still debate, Cleopatra's squadron of 60 ships, which had been held in reserve, suddenly hoisted its sails and broke through the lines, fleeing the battle. Was this a pre-planned escape? A moment of panic? We may never truly know. But what happened next sealed Antony's fate. Seeing Cleopatra's purple sails disappearing over the horizon, Antony abandoned his men, his command, and his massive flagship. He transferred to a smaller, faster ship and raced after her, leaving his fleet leaderless and in disarray. The psychological blow was devastating. The sight of their general deserting them in the middle of a battle shattered the morale of Antony's forces. Confusion turned to despair. One by one, his ships were captured or surrendered. By the end of the day, what was once a mighty fleet was either at the bottom of the sea or under Octavian's control. The battle was a catastrophic loss for Antony. The aftermath was swift and brutal. The defeat at Actium wasn't just a military loss. It was a political implosion. News of the disaster spread like wildfire. Antony and Cleopatra's allies, sensing the shift in power, abandoned them. Kings and client rulers who had once sworn loyalty to Antony quickly switched their allegiance to Octavian to save their own skins. Their support network, built over years, vanished overnight. Antony and Cleopatra managed to escape back to Alexandria in Egypt, but they were isolated and running out of time. They were like cornered animals, with Octavian's legions closing in. Their military power was broken, their treasury was dwindling, and their allies were gone. The grand dream of an Eastern Roman Empire, ruled from Alexandria, had been shattered in the waters of Actium. Less than a year later, Octavian arrived in Egypt. Faced with the inevitable, Antony and Cleopatra chose to end their own lives, creating one of history's most enduring legends. The Battle of Actium was the climax of their story, the decisive moment that stripped them of their power and paved the way for Octavian to become Augustus, the first Roman emperor. It marked the end of the Roman Republic and the dawn of the Roman Empire. And that's the dramatic story of the Battle of Actium. It's a powerful reminder of, have you ever felt like you've hit rock bottom, like everything you've built has crumbled to dust? That's exactly where Mark Antony found himself after the devastating Battle of Actium. This wasn't just a military loss, it was the complete annihilation of his world. Imagine being one of the most powerful men on the planet, a celebrated Roman general, a charismatic leader, and then, in the span of a single afternoon, losing it all. The Antony who returned to Alexandria after that defeat was a ghost of his former self. The swagger, the confidence, the larger-than-life personality that had captivated Rome and wooed the Queen of Egypt was gone, replaced by a deep, dark depression that clung to him like a shroud. He shut himself away from the world, building a solitary pier by the harbor, which he grimly named as Teminum, after a famous Athenian recluse who despised mankind. Here, he would sit for hours, staring out at the sea, contemplating his ruin. His political power evaporated overnight. Senators and client kings who had once flocked to his side, pledging eternal loyalty, now scrambled to swear allegiance to his rival, Octavian. Messages went unanswered. Armies deserted. The vast Eastern Empire he had commanded was slipping through his fingers like sand. Every whisper on the wind sounded like a harbinger of doom. Antony was consumed by paranoia and fear. The thought of being captured, dragged through the streets of Rome in chains for Octavian's triumphal parade, and then publicly executed. It was a nightmare. He lived with every waking moment. This was a fate worse than death for a man of his pride. And what about Cleopatra? Her fate was inextricably tied to his. She watched the man she loved, the father of her children, the mighty warrior who was supposed to protect her kingdom, dissolve into despair. His mental collapse was a terrifying mirror of her own precarious situation. She tried everything to rouse him from his stupor. She threw lavish parties, organized grand festivals, and tried to reignite the spark that had once defined them. But it was no use. The darkness that had enveloped Antony was so profound that it began to swallow her too. She saw the writing on the wall. Octavian's forces were closing in. Her kingdom, her legacy, and the lives of her children were all on the line. While Antony was lost in his private hell, Cleopatra was forced to confront their shared reality. She began making her own desperate plans, sending envoys to Octavian, trying to negotiate a future for her children, even as she prepared for the worst. She had a magnificent mausoleum constructed, a final resting place filled with treasure, but it was also a fortress, a last resort. The tragedy of Antony's final days is not just a story of military defeat. It's a deeply human story about the fragility of power and the devastating impact of mental collapse. It shows how even the greatest among us can be broken by loss and despair. The once great general who had commanded legions and charmed a queen was now a man haunted by his own failures, unable to escape the prison of his mind. And as he spiraled, he dragged the last great queen of Egypt down with him, sealing both their fates in one of history's most epic